Welcome to the Chess Angle. This is not your typical chess podcast. If you're an amateur or club-level player, the Chess Angle is for you. Our content is aimed at busy adults who are serious about the game but have limited study time. Featured guests include both amateur and titled players alike. And now, here's your host, Director of the Long Island Chess Club, Neal Bellon.
Welcome, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. I want to apologize up front. I am fighting a little bit of an upper respiratory infection. I'm recording this in June of 2024. I guess I'll say the date in case anyone's listening to this like 10 years from now. But at this time where I am in New York, here on Long Island, COVID is making a comeback. I don't have COVID. I'm negative, but I do have a garden variety upper respiratory infection. A lot of viruses going around right now, so I apologize for my voice. I hope I don't sound like an 80-year-old chain smoker named Marge, but that's how I feel. That's what it sounds like to me. But I am going to plow through and discuss an instructive game this week. I'm on a bit of a solo episode kick, and I'm on a bit of a game analysis kick as well, where I discuss a game that I played at the club thematically. Basically, I discuss the main ideas and themes and takeaways, what I learned from it, what we can all learn from it. Before we get into the game, just a few quick reminders. If you have a question or a topic idea for the podcast, I would love to hear from you. You can email directly info@thechessangle.com, or you can go on our website, thechessangle.com, and click the contact link. If you're on Twitter, be sure to follow us at The Chess Angle. We also have a YouTube channel, so you can listen to episodes there as well. And if you would subscribe to the YouTube channel, it would be greatly appreciated. If you'd like to support the show, you can buy me a virtual coffee. We do have a Buy Me a Coffee page, and all of these links, as always, are in the show notes. So we just finished up a tournament at the Long Island Chess Club, did pretty well. I lost the last round game. Tough loss. It was against a very strong 1900 player, but he was playing, I think, even stronger than that. I held my own, but he had this attack and I just couldn't keep it together, but really good game, instructive. Other than that, did pretty well. So I was pretty happy about that. And the game that I'm going to be discussing this week was from an earlier round in the tournament. I can't remember if it was round 2 or 3, but I think there's definitely some things that we can all learn from it. So let's jump right in. So my opponent was rated 1697, I guess call it 1700, and I was white, so I opened with a London, surprise, surprise, and he played pretty normally. He opened with knight f6 as black, and then e6, and then he fianchettoed his light squared bishop on b7. So he has that fianchettoed pawn structure with the pawns on a7, b6, and c7. We'll talk about that in a minute, because that's a specific structure that you should know how to attack. But anyway, this is a London system opening, pretty straightforward. And we end up in a position where, I have the typical London triangle with the pawns on d4, c3, and e3. His pawns are on d6 and e6, so he's holding back a little bit. He didn't play for d5 yet. And his plan, he's looking to get in the e5 break, which I'm going to try to prevent. But of course, if he does get it in, depending on the circumstances, you're still fine as white. Now, let's talk about that fianchetto structure that I mentioned before. Whenever black has a fianchettoed bishop, I mean, this is true for white as well, but we'll look at it from attacking as white. Whenever black has that fianchettoed position, you can often chip away at it with the rook pawn. So if it's on the queen side for black, which is what he had here, again, his pawns are on a7, b6, and c7. And a common theme against that structure, not just in London, but I guess in any system where he uses it, is to push a4. And that's what I played here. And the idea is you go a4 to a5, you're then hitting his b6 pawn. You're kind of chipping away at his queen side. Now, against a King's Indian type of defense, where black has his king side bishop, fianchetto on g7, that's where as white you can play like h4, h5 and try to chip at g6 that way. There are many lines in the London where that happens, especially with the Jabava. But what I did here was I played a4 as a positional move. And then, of course, he played a5, right? Because he wanted to block me from going a5. And so his queenside pawn structure is maybe a little bit weak. He's fine for now. But that idea of playing a rook pawn thrust against the fianchettoed pawn structure, that's an important idea to be aware of. So that's the first takeaway from this game. And then the next thing I want to talk about is the idea of never moving the same piece twice in the opening, because that's one of those common expressions that are out there, right? Don't move the same piece twice in the opening. Now, here's the thing. As a general principle, that is true, that is correct, because you want to develop all your pieces. But it's position dependent, as with any quote-unquote rule. And there are many, many times where you can move the same piece twice or even 3 times and you're fine, which is what I did here. I had moved my queen to c2, and then he moved his rook to c8 on the same file. Now, we both have our pawns still there, so there's no immediate threat. Sometimes there's some tactics involving like knight takes pawn, and then the pawn is pinned to the queen, that type of thing. And what I did was, when I first moved my queen there, I saw that, yes, he can move his rook to c8. But then I thought I was fine. And then here's what happens at the amateur level all the time is you sort of get paranoid or nervous for no reason. So I had my queen on the same file. It was perfectly fine there. There was no threat. I just didn't analyze enough. But I moved it off of c2 again. So I moved it on the c file, moved it back. I moved the same piece twice. I didn't need to. But here's the point. My position's totally fine. There are many times where moving the same piece twice might actually be correct. It might be correct to avoid falling for a tactical shot. It might be correct because you misjudged the position when you first moved it there. You thought it was safe, but now it's not. And especially if it's sort of a closed, sort of a slow, more positional game, that type of slow maneuvering is okay, especially if the center hasn't opened up and it's not like a wild tactical battle. So yes, as a general rule, you don't want to move the same piece twice in the opening because you want to develop all your pieces. But what I'm saying is there are plenty of times where not only moving the same piece twice is okay, but it might even be the correct move. And here I just sort of kind of shuffled my queen because I didn't analyze well, and really no big deal. I'm totally fine. The position's perfectly equal right here. We're on move 12. Now the next takeaway, and this is a big discussion, this is something a lot of people talk about, are the idea of moving your h-pawn to h3 or h6 as black to prevent a piece from going on the square, right? To prevent a piece from going on g4 as white, or as black to prevent white hopping onto g5, right? We play that h-pawn move. We move it up one square, and usually we're preventing a knight from going on that square, or we're preventing a bishop from going on that square, which might pin our knight. It also gives the king what they call Luft, right, or room, so that down the road, he has a square to escape to, so there's no back rank mate threat. But what you have to watch out for is that when you make those h3 or h6 moves, that it doesn't set up a tactical shot, because technically when you play those moves, in a sense, you're weakening your king side. And what you have to watch out for is if that h3 or h6 pawn for black is attacked by a bishop, there might be a sack there, right? Like, let's say from white's point of view, if black plays h6, white might be able to go bishop takes h6, and then he goes g takes h6. And in some cases, white can either win 2 pawns for the piece and get a vicious attack, or it can create long-term positional pressure because you've weakened the king side. So always be aware of that. Those sort of h3, h6 moves, I mean, on the queen side, it's a3 or a6, but your king's not over there. I mean, unless you're castled on that side. But with those h3, h6 moves, They're generally okay. They're good sort of housekeeping moves because it keeps pieces off of, that either G4, G5 square, but always be aware of any tactical shots that can involve your opponent sacking a piece for that pawn. So whenever you play those H3, H6 moves, just make sure that you analyze and that you're not making things worse. And where you can really get into trouble is if your opponent has like a bishop and a queen battery on that diagonal, and then they can sack, right? It's like bishop takes pawn, and then you take back with your pawn, and then his queen takes. And if his queen can enter into your position by your king, and he also has a knight or another piece to follow up, you can get into trouble. So just, be aware of that. But in this particular case, it was perfectly fine. I had played H3, which is very typical in the London for white because it gives an escape square, not so much for the king, but for the dark squared bishop on F4. And for black playing H6, it prevents any knight hop to G5. Generally, I mean, there actually might be some tactical sequences where that's actually correct, but that's not what's in play here. So didn't mean to get too long-winded, but always check those sort of H3 and H6 moves for tactics before you play them for a positional reason. Next thing I want to talk about is the idea of black getting in E5. Now, I'm going to talk about the London, but even if you don't play the London, this is kind of a theme in general. I know with the London and a lot of other D-pawn openings, the idea is, well, you don't want black to get in E5, right? Because then it's like he equalizes. You don't want to get in E5. But as I've mentioned before, some stronger players talk about it as if that's completely winning for black or as if you've completely ruined your position for white. No. If black gets in E5, let's say in the London, maybe he'll equalize, but you're fine. And in some cases, it's okay for him to get in E5 and you can't prevent it. And in this case, it was a little harder to prevent because he didn't have a pawn on D5, right? So his pawn is on D6. So when he pushes E5, he has a D6 pawn to support it. But I was totally fine here. The idea with E5, if you see that after some exchanges, you're actually better or equal, you're fine. So in this case, I really wasn't worried at all. So don't freak out if you see black getting that E5 break in certain lines of the London. Now, if you put the game into an engine, and as a reminder, for these game analysis episodes, I always put a PGN file, you'll see that black's E5 is nothing to worry about. And white is still maybe a tad better here, according to the engine. I mean, again, it's, 0.13 plus 0.13, which of course you cannot take these engine numbers literally. But the point I'm trying to make is it's not like this is some type of winning move for black. So don't freak out if he gets in that pawn break. And I took some time here and I saw that after some exchanges here that I'm at least equal, maybe even a bit better. And it turns out that I was actually able to attack his E5 pawn twice, right? So I have a knight on F3, a knight on C4, and then my bishop on H2 is attacking it as well. So he has a decision to make here. So other players might freak out about that E5 break, but I analyzed. I saw that I could hit it 3 times and he had to make a decision. He actually did not handle it well. He should have just pushed the pawn to E4, attacking my knight, and then it would have been protected 3 times and he would have gained some space as well. Instead, he traded his beautiful fianchettoed bishop on B7 for my knight on F3. It's not a blunder. It's actually an engine-approved move. But I'm calling it a mistake because I think that if he had pushed the pawn, it's a lot stronger. So he ends up trading. His idea was that he was going to remove an attacker of his pawn. So what he played was fine, but pushing the pawn would have been a little bit stronger, would have had to make me think a little more. So he takes, and then I take back, and now I have the 2 bishops, as they say, which I'm just laughing because that's just, I have the 2 bishops. I really do think at our level, that's one of the most overrated positional features, or that's one of the most overrated, I guess, material features, because sure, the 2 bishops might be an advantage on some level, but most of us at the amateur level really don't have the skill to take advantage of that but it's something. But I wasn't thinking, ooh, I have the two bishops. I was thinking, okay, because of the trade he just did, my light squared bishop is now in a much better square. Now he pushed his pawn, and then my bishop on f3 is attacked. And here's where we get into the whole time pressure discussion. I've been talking about time pressure in the past few episodes. He attacked my bishop, and basically I only have two squares that I can go to. And I saw this. I can go back to e2, tuck it back to e2, or I can go bishop g4, which would involve a trade. And I'm looking at it, and my thinking was, if I go bishop g4, he might go knight takes g4, queen takes g4, and my queen is on the g file. Maybe I can attack that somehow. And I was also looking at simply tucking it back to e2, a more quiet positional move, but it also defends my knight on c4. It turns out the engine does like the move I played better, which is bishop e2. Now, I took a little bit of time here to think, but here's where you can easily get into time pressure if you obsess. And I was agonizing a bit because there seems to be pluses and minuses to both. If I tuck it back to e2, it just seemed a little too passive. But if I moved it to g4, I didn't really see a follow-up, and I'm giving up what could be a potentially strong bishop on a board that's starting to open up a little bit. But I made a decision. So I moved it back to e2, and I was thinking, I'm not sure if that was the right move, but it was the correct move based on the time control, right? This is a game 90 with a 10-second delay. I can't sit there and obsess for 12, 13 minutes over what square to put this on when I really wasn't seeing a clear difference. And as I assumed during the game, I was correct. Neither one is really a blunder. In fact, bishop e2 is actually considered the best move. But just a little bit about my thought process, because this is a type of position where a piece is attacked, there's only two squares for it to go. You can easily waste a lot of time on your clock deciding where it should go. And then when you really need time later on, if the position gets really thorny, you don't have it because you wasted it obsessing over which square might be better. So we're on about move 18 of the game. We're going to take a short break, and we'll be back in just a moment to continue discussing this game that was played at the Long Island Chess Club. Okay, so something happened here. I made a little bit of an inaccuracy. And this happens all the time. I hate when I do this, and we all do it, which is you have a piece that's on a good square, and then you move it to attack your opponent's piece, but then you realize there was no reason for you to move it, and that the attack was just kind of a useless one-move attack that he can easily get out of. So that's a very, very important theme. I know Jeremy Silman, who I love, has spoken about this a lot. In other words, don't move a piece that attacks your opponent's piece if he can simply move it to safety or has a response. And the new square that your piece is on is pretty much useless and you're going to have to move it again. So in other words, if you're going to move one of your pieces that attacks your opponent's piece, if he can simply move it to a new square and your piece is on a worse square as a result, then there's no need to do it. Don't attack a piece of your opponent's once. If he can just move it or trade it or move it to a better square, you need to see the follow-up. And here's what happened. I had this knight on d4, middle of the board. It was protected by pawns on e3 and c3. Really nicely placed knight. I thought he had something potentially attacking it with c5, and then I would have to move it, and he was going to double on the file. Again, this is where you sort of see ghosts, and this is what happens when you play at the club at night. I should have just left it there, and I could have attacked his knight with a pawn. I could have moved my king. I had about 3 or 4 other ideas. What I played wasn't a mistake, but it just doesn't really do anything, if that makes sense. It was one of those moves where you're not blundering, but it's like not helping. Like it's you're just kind of like wasting time. I should have just left it there, but that's a common thing. You make these one move attacks, and then he can either trade that piece or just move it to safety. And then you're like, why did I do that? That made no sense. So that's something that's very, very common. So I basically attacked his rook with my knight. He ended up just trading rooks. And then I ended up moving my knight back to the original square anyway. I guess that happens sometimes if you're not sure of the idea, or again, if you're seeing ghosts, if you see a quote unquote threat that's not really there. A lot of mistakes happen that way, but the knight was totally fine. There was no tactics. And I even remember at the time, I was like really annoyed that I played that. I sort of spaced out there. It happens. Again, no harm, no foul, but I really get annoyed with myself because if I want to grow as a player, I have to stop doing that. I don't do it all the time, but this was one of those situations where, it just didn't really help because when I did the one move attack, I also saw a potential fork where I could fork his king and rook, but he can easily defend against that. And the whole point is that after moving my knight, I'm going to have to move it anyway because it's kind of vulnerable where it is. So that's the real takeaway with the one move attacks is when you do it and he moves his piece to safety or trade it, you have to say, okay, is the new square my piece on good? Am I actually improving the position of my piece by doing it, by moving it there, I should say? Or am I just going to have to move it back? And I ended up just moving it back. So when you attack one of your opponent's pieces, really look at the follow through and what everything's going to be like when it comes out in the wash. Didn't mean to ramble on about that, but that's an extremely common mistake. I see it all the time, and I used to do it a lot more when I was a weaker player, but even stronger players still make that mistake. Always just watch out for those one move attacks if your opponent can simply get out of it. Now, speaking of knights and positional ideas, as you may know, knights like to be further up the board, obviously, and knights like to be on a secure square where they can't get kicked away by a pawn. And that's something you should always watch out for. You want good squares for your knights, and when you defend, you want to take away those squares. Now, a knight on the 6th rank that cannot be kicked away is lethal because when it's on the 6th rank, you may say, well, why not the 7th rank or something like that? Because on the 6th rank, it covers so many squares. It's brutal. So like in this case, if black can get his knight to D3, that can be tough for me. Now, in the middle game, and if you're attacking and with the queens on, if you can get a secure knight on, let's say, D3 or D6 or anywhere on the 6th rank, that can be brutal. In fact, many strong players, or as far as chess theory, the idea is that a knight that is securely posted on the 6th rank is actually more valuable than a rook. And many players have actually traded their rook. They've sacked the exchange because the knight is so annoying, and they usually get a pawn for it. So they'll sack their rook for a knight and pawn. And there may be times where that's actually a good idea because that knight can be paralyzing. So here's my point. He had a chance possibly to get his knight to D3. Now my bishop's protecting that square, and I can certainly move my knight to defend it. But I was thinking, okay, if I take his knight, he takes back with his pawn, then I get a passed pawn. Am I going to be able to stop that? But again, and this is kind of a theme in this game, is that sort of chess paranoia. I was worried over nothing. And sometimes, even if he gets his knight to that square, you can then chip away at it by attacking the pawn that it's protecting. And I knew this, but I just didn't see it. So the idea was, if he goes knight to D3, let's say he gets his knight there and I can't attack it, I just go F3, attacking the E4 pawn that's protecting it. And then he has to make a decision. And I just didn't analyze. So the reason I'm mentioning this, the whole point is that I made this knight move. I did this knight B3 move because I didn't want him to go knight C5, which will lead to knight D3, but I didn't need to do it. So even if he got his knight to D3, I can defend against it by attacking the pawn that's protecting his knight. So a lot of this game you'll see was just poor analysis and just worrying over nothing, right? It's like Danny Kopeck, who I studied, used to tell me, I am Danny Kopeck, like you can't stop everything. But I mean, in this case, I could have. So I'm freaking out about this knight D3 hop when I can easily defend against it. And so my knight on B3 is pretty much doing nothing. I should have attacked him or thought more offensively here because, again, I can always go F3, hitting the pawn that's protecting his knight. I guess the takeaway is if your opponent has a move that seems to be non-preventable, like there's nothing you can do to prevent him from going to that square, then just say, okay, even if he does go to that square, is that a done deal? Do I still have a resource? And in this case, they did. It's like, okay, he goes there, you just play F3. But often we miss those moves. We're so concerned about him getting to that square, getting that knight to that square, that we think it's over then. We say, okay, he's going to make that knight hop. I can't do anything. But once it's there, do I still have a resource? But we often don't look at that. We think, oh, well, he got there. We think that the only solution is to prevent the piece from going to that square. We don't think in terms of, okay, even if he gets there, I can then do something afterwards. That's what I missed. So that was kind of just a thought process analysis thing. Another night, maybe I would have seen this right away and I would have moved my knight to a better square than B3. So basically, I made a useless defensive move. That's sort of the short version of this. So always be aware that even if he can carry out his plan, that you still may have a resource once he achieves it. So now let's talk about the end game a little bit more. So I'm on move 34 now, and it's pretty much even, and it's a bishop versus knight ending. So we each have 6 pawns. I have a bishop, he has a knight. Now let's talk about that. Let's talk about bishop versus knight. Generally speaking, and you know how I feel about rules and principles because everything is position dependent. Generally speaking, on an open board, so there's a lot of open squares and we have pawns on both sides of the board. In those type of open positions, bishops are generally more valuable than knights because they can strike from a distance, they can cover an entire diagonal, and they can easily move around. Knights are a little more clunky. Knights are better in closed positions where the pawns are locked, because obviously with a lot of locked pawns, the bishop doesn't have as much scope. So even though theoretically it's equal, I knew that if I wanted to win this, that I would somehow have to make use of that. So my plan was get my pawns moving, get my king active, try to create weak pawns that I can attack, stop his counterplay. But it's tricky right now. There's a lot of analysis. You got to watch out for those knight forks and those knight hops, that he can't somehow fork a pawn and my king with the check. I mean, that's the one thing. The bishop might have more freedom to move in an open position, but those knight hops and those knight forks, you really got to watch out for those because those are really annoying. But I will say this, just because one player has the bishop versus the knight in an open board, that doesn't mean you're winning, because a lot of players think, oh, I'm completely winning because I have the bishop versus the knight. No, it's what you do with it. I knew it was a quote-unquote advantage, but I also knew that it wasn't going to win itself, and I need to be careful. But don't think that because you have the bishop versus the knight on an open board that it's an automatic win. There's still a lot going on. Now, the good thing about my bishop here is I was thinking very positionally, because when your opponent's knight, I should say, is on an opposite colored square from your bishop can often control the squares that the knight can hop to. That's what I was doing here. I was sort of like dominating his knight, right? Because that's really how you win these positions, right? I want to make my bishop better than his knight, and he wants to make his knight better than his bishop. And you also want to look at pawn moves and pawn levers that can possibly create a passed pawn or improve your structure. I did a pawn move here. I played B4, which attacked his knight, right? He moved it back. And then with that tempo, I then moved my king up, right? Because you have to have an active king in the end game. You got to get your king in there. The king controls squares. It attacks pawns and pieces. You have to get your king involved. You can't just play with the minor piece and pawns that you have. So we're both moving our king to the center. And again, this is one of those endgame positions where you really, really have to be patient and you have to analyze. Now, before we talk about the position itself, I want to talk about sort of outwitting your opponent, or just the spirit of competition in general. And here it is. If you know that your opponent has a certain weakness, it's okay to exploit that, and you should exploit that. And that's one of the advantages at playing at a weekly club, is that you learn the players and what their habits are and their strengths and weaknesses. You learn which players are more positional, which are more tactical, which players, if they can't mate you in the middle game, are going to completely fall apart in the end game, which players get tired at the end and tend to blunder, which players are more likely to accept or offer a draw, all these things. Now, with my opponent, a little bit older, not like old, but, little older, I know that he sometimes gets sloppy in the end game. He gets tired and he makes mistakes. And that's what I was waiting for here. And now we get into an ethical thing. Like, let's say you're playing an older player. It doesn't even have to be an older player because even younger players get tired. But if you're playing someone, let's say of a certain age, and then in the end game they drop the ball, is that ethical to sort of play for an end game? Because you know that there's a good chance they'll make a mistake. I don't really think so, because you're simply you're exploiting a weakness of your opponent, and that's part of the spirit of competition. Just as if I had an opponent who is very tactical and liked those positions, but completely falls apart in those boring positional games, I'm going to go for the boring positional game because I know he's going to force something. He's going to try to play a tactic that doesn't exist, and I'll win the game. So what I was doing here was I was trying to sort of extend the game and play it out as much as I could, because I know that he ends up dropping the ball in end games, which is what happened. And also, I do feel I'm a pretty decent end game player as far as this level, right? I do consider myself, I'm not going to say I'm a phenomenal end game specialist, right? I'm not Pal Benko or anything. But at this level, I think I'm pretty good. I think I'm above average, and I like end games. So if you think about it, I have a love for end games and a certain skill for end games. My opponent tends to make mistakes in end games, so it makes sense for me to bring this to an end game. And I like grinding anyway. So something to think about. There's nothing wrong with exploiting your opponent's weaknesses, especially if that weakness is one of your strengths. So basically, I mean, we're always hoping your opponent makes a mistake, but I knew he was more prone to do it in the end game. So that was my thought process here. So that was sort of the chess psychology part of this analysis. Now, I've been talking a lot lately about draw offers, almost ad nauseum. I'm sure some of you might even be annoyed by that, but I happen to find the whole psychology of draw offers fascinating. But I will say this, I'm not going to go into a whole thing about draw offers, just a quick comment. There was no way I was taking a draw here. Absolutely no way. My clock was fine, but even if I were in a little bit of time pressure, I kind of knew the basic plan. I felt confident. Like, there was no way I was taking a draw here. And part of the motivation for that was because I know he's very prone to making mistakes in the end game. And that's a very, very common thing. A lot of players, they'll play, say, 1800 strength and above. Let's say, like take his rating, right? He's rated 1697, typical. A lot of players rated 1697, they'll play like an 1800 or a 2000 player for the whole game or most of the game. The opening, the middle game, they'll play so well. And then in the late end game, it's like somebody flips a switch and they play like a 1400 or a 1000 player. That's kind of what happened here. Well, I shouldn't say that. It's not that that's what happened here, but he ended up making a double question mark blunder that if a similar position occurred earlier in the game, maybe he wouldn't have made, if that makes sense. But that's very, very common, and that's what I was waiting for. So, been talking about draws. There was no way I was going to take a draw here. Now, he told me after the game, around this point, we're at move 36, he was thinking of offering me a draw, but I know I wouldn't have taken it. So this was one of those positions where I was going to go for broke. I said, I'm definitely playing for the win. Now, down the road, if for some reason I feel my position got worse, if I make a mistake, if I'm in severe time pressure, then I can look at that. But there was no way I was taking a draw. Like, this was one of those games, I was feeling it. I wanted to play for the win. I liked my position. So just some thoughts there. And then we get to the moment that I was waiting for. He made a pawn move on move 41 that was indeed a double question mark blunder. And here's the thing, and this is where endgame skill and experience comes in. You have to know when to transpose into a winning king and pawn ending. I've said that many times on the podcast. And just to be clear what I mean by that, we each have, other than our kings and our pawns, we each have one minor piece. Remember, I have a bishop, he has a knight. You have to know if that point comes when trading the bishop for the knight is going to be winning for you. And you have to be careful because very often when you trade down into a king and pawn ending, it's usually decisive. It could be drawn, but many times when that trade is made, one side is usually better. I saw this right away. This was one of those things where he made this pawn move. He played C5, double question mark. And I didn't move immediately, but when he did it, I said, wait a minute. I go bishop takes knight, king takes bishop. I shift my king over. I'm going to get the jump on his king and win. Like I saw it immediately. My read was correct. I still took my time though and analyzed. I handled my clock very well this game, so I had the time to do it. But I'm looking at it and I was right. And that's all it takes is one tempo. Like you have a square or two of a jump on your opponent's king and you're winning. So I analyzed. I said, okay, bishop takes knight. There's no tactics with the pawns. He has to take back. So bishop takes knight, king takes bishop. It shifts his king to the side. And then I move my king to the center. And I'm going to get an outside passed pawn that's going to be winning. Because what's going to happen is he's going to have to chase my passed pawn, and then I just clean everything up. Now, he has a passed pawn as well, but I'm able to capture that easily because my outside passed pawn was further away. But the bottom line is, when he made this pawn move, this C4, I saw that this was the correct moment to trade into a winning king and pawn ending. After this, it was pretty much over. And this is the mistake that I was waiting for. Now, to be clear, even players who don't tend to get tired in the endgame, this is a very common thing at the amateur level in general. Even if it's a younger opponent and they feel great, they're not tired, they can easily make this mistake because it's sometimes hard to analyze. Because when he pushed his pawn to C5, what he was probably thinking was, I'm going to take his pawn and then he'll take my pawn with his king and his king gets in the position. He didn't see, this is a bit of a Zweijensug, an in-between move. This is where he didn't see I have bishop takes knight. Now, I spoke about how looking for those in-between moves is often a cause of time pressure. I was referring to people who do that excessively and when the position doesn't call for it. Here, when he played C5, it was like ding, ding. It was like this light went on. I said, wait a minute. I trade our minor pieces and I'm winning. But I looked at it and he wasn't expecting that. And that's something you need to be aware of. Just because your opponent makes a pawn move and you can take it with your pawn, can you ignore it and do something else that's winning? So he didn't see bishop takes knight there. He figured I was just going to take the pawn back. In fact, if I do go b takes c5 check, it's even. He might even be a little bit better. But I didn't play that. I analyzed and I correctly traded down into a winning king and pawn ending. Very, very important. That's how you win these endgames. You have to be patient. Don't force things. And you got to wait for that blunder. And then he ended up resigning a few moves down the road because, again, he couldn't protect or defend against my outside passed pawn on the A file and my threats in the middle as well. So basically, while he's chasing my passed A pawn, my king just cleans house. So I take his knight, he goes king takes bishop, and then I have a passed A pawn, he has a passed C pawn, but my passed pawn is winning. And then I just move my king to the middle. And here I've done this enough that I saw that it was completely over. Here I can just breathe easy. This was just a very basic technical king and pawn ending. But he had a chance later in the game to trip me up a little bit and he missed it. It's still winning, but it's one of those things where I only had one winning move if he played a certain way and I could have easily missed it. So even though I said it was completely winning here, there is one thing I want to mention. On the king side, he took back with sort of the wrong pawn. In other words, the way he took back, he can take back with either the H pawn or the F pawn. He took back with the H pawn, which made things extremely easy for me. It turns out if he had taken back with the F pawn, I actually only have one move that wins, which is to play A5 to push my passed pawn. But he also has a passed pawn on the C file. So if I had moved my king instead, which also kind of looks winning, he could actually squeeze out the draw. So you got to be real careful. I was almost thinking, all right, well, this is over. There's nothing he can do. But he did have a resource here. Now, a few moves earlier, he had played this pawn move like G5. He did G7 to G5, and he did it quickly and without thinking. That's what I call a frustration move, which is basically he probably on some level saw my A pawn was winning, and he just kind of lashed out on the king side, like I'm going to get my pawns moving, but he didn't analyze. What happens is when you see that your opponent's better, there's a frustration there, and one mistake leads to another. But if he had really hunkered down, he would have seen that F takes G5 instead of H takes G5. Doesn't really matter if you don't know the position, right? He had two ways to take back, right? We talk about exchange sequences on this podcast a lot. He had a second way of taking my pawn back that could have easily given me problems if I was careless. If I had moved my king up, which I might, like just glancing at this position, after he takes with his F pawn, it seems that moving my king up is correct, but he can actually draw the game because of his kingside pawns. And the point I'm trying to make is this: when he took back with the H pawn, he made it a lot easier for me. And if he had taken back with the F pawn, I only have one move that's winning, which is to push my A pawn. All the other moves lead to a draw. If you think you're losing, even if your position seems worse, you may still have a resource. And if he had taken back with the F pawn, this game might have ended up in a draw if I didn't see it. And there's a good chance I may not have seen it, because moving my king here and looking at it sort of instinctively instead of pushing the A pawn, there's a good chance I may have done that. Like I'm looking at king D4 here. Like if someone said, look at this position quickly, make a move, I'm thinking king D4 is winning, and it's not, because he has these two connected pawns on the king side. So it's just amazing how the slightest little subtlety can change the course of the game. And even though I was quote unquote winning, he still had this resource. If he had taken with the F pawn, where he could have tripped me up and ended up drawing the game. He missed it. And this is what happens when you feel like you're losing. You sort of just give up and you feel like you're just moving pieces around and hoping for a miracle. But anyway, when he took H takes G5, then it was definitely over. There's no more real tricks or resources here unless I completely space out. So I thought that was a very instructive game. A lot of takeaways, a lot of chess psychology, a lot of things and positions that come up all the time at this level. Next week's episode, little teaser, will not be a game analysis episode. It's going to be sort of a reaction piece or a reaction episode to something I saw posted online. So that should be an interesting episode for next week. Again, I'm on a little bit of a solo episode kick, which was always my original intent for the podcast anyway. At any rate, really appreciate you listening. And as always, I hope you win your next game. Have a great day, everybody.